I am going to introduce myself. We do have a few people on Zoom with us as well, um, and up here on the stage, but we will do introductions as we begin speaking, just to kind of get things started. So today, we'll be talking about local contexts. My name is Ashley Rojas. I'm a software and web developer for Local Contexts. I've been with them for 2.5 years now, and originally I am from the United States, in Connecticut, where I live and work, or what's Wappinger Homelands as well. Unfortunately, one of the chairs of the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Working Group, Maui Hudson, could not make it for a last-minute emergency, but he sends his regards and looks forward to connecting with a few people after RDA as well. There you go. So before we begin, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement. Today, we're gathered on the homelands of the Wetar people, who have been the caretakers of this land since the time immemorial. We would like to pay our respects to the ancestors and the present and future generations of this land. Shown here is our organizational land acknowledgement. Since Local Context is based across multiple countries, we acknowledge that all of the lands and waters that we occupy are indigenous homelands. And our work is focused on addressing the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism and supporting a more equitable future. We do a land acknowledgement to disrupt settler colonialism and recognize whose lands we're on, as well as our responsibilities as guests here. So the plan for our session today will be a brief overview of local contexts and where local context is being utilized. With some examples, we will take a look at the Local Context Hub, which I'll explain what that is as well. Our API and current metadata work that we're doing, as well as looking at repository integrations and next steps. So please utilize the collaborative notes. There was also a link added in the chat as well. We have a PDF of the slides too, so if something's too small on the screen here in person or online, please pull it up so that you can take a look at that more. And then this session is also being translated, so please utilize that if you would like to as well. Okay, so Local Context started in 2010 as an intervention to bring Indigenous cultural authority and data sovereignty back into cultural heritage spaces, such as libraries, archives, and museums. That's a short list. It can be included into many other places. It has since expanded into data repositories, including genomic data repositories as well. To establish cultural authority and data sovereignty, Local Context worked in partnership with Indigenous communities to create the traditional knowledge labels. After the TK labels, the notices for institutions and researchers were also developed. And more recently, the biocultural labels for biocultural collections and data. We'll expand a bit more on both the labels and notices later, but just to continue with Local Contexts, we started as a research project based out of universities in the US and Aotearoa, New Zealand, but in 2002 became an independent nonprofit organization registered in the Navajo Nation. As part of that transition to a nonprofit, we established an Indigenous-led council, which is continuing to grow. And here is our lovely team made up of our council and staff. And our staff is composed of a tech development and design team, operations team, and outreach team. We're an international organization based across North America and Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're mostly connecting remotely, but are occasionally able to connect in person for certain events, conferences, and training programs. And just to give a bit of an idea of how widespread interest and application of local context labels and notices have been, this map shows our global connections of communities, institutions, and researchers interested in or using the local context system. As you can see, our connections are especially strong in North America and Oceania, where our team is mostly based. Um, we have largely been working in English, but are growing to support other languages as well as other geographical areas as our team continues to grow. There's also increasing interests in Latin America, with some projects starting in Ecuador, Chile, and Colombia. So we want to talk a bit about some of the ideas that prompted the creation of local contexts, with the challenges Indigenous people see in data and information systems. First, Indigenous data collections are held by institutions around the world, including, as I mentioned before, museums, libraries, etc. As previously mentioned as well, due to colonial legacy of how those materials were collected, significant information is often missing. Information like community names are often excluded or not considered important, or even wrong, or they're incorrect. This misinformation and misattribution continues to affect communities, their ability to find their information and reassert control. Further, communities are largely not the legal rights owners of their own materials. This is because the way that intellectual property operates, which is based on 15th century colonial law, and even across countries and states, copyright law is often similar because of this common origin. This law only allows certain types of authorship to be recognized, one that's very much based on the form of the material, on singular named authors, and what's perceived as original. This means that communities often have a lack of control and governance over the material, which is ultimately an issue of sovereignty. This becomes more concerning as some Indigenous knowledge and collections are not open or should have restricted access. And to this, there's more researchers working with Indigenous peoples and data more than ever. And much of an extractive or reductive research paradigm often remains in this place. And of course, in this era of open data, big data, these mistakes and omissions which exist in metadata are replicated into far-reaching digital forms of this material. With these issues, the Indigenous communities, that we work with are looking for a way to intervene and interrupt these systems. And I just wanted to highlight the care principles here. So far within this conference, I've heard a lot of FAIR data. I have not heard as much about care principles as well. But the current movement toward open data and open science doesn't fully engage with Indigenous communities, Indigenous people's rights and interests, because of the power differentials and historical contexts that are perpetuated within these spaces. CARE, alongside FAIR, is centered on how data can be made in support of Indigenous data sovereignty and benefit sharing, and allow for Indigenous collective benefit, authority to control, and responsibility and ethics around this data. And the CARE principles, of course, are our guiding principle for the work that we've been doing. So to get more into the labels and notices, both are digital labeling tools that we've developed. They are markers of Indigenous rights, interests, and cultural authority that can be used in a variety of contexts. We've seen them used in databases, collections, catalogs, archival records, apps, websites, course syllabi, and even more recently, a thesis, and many more applications that are yet to be utilized. We're going to start with our tools for institutions and researchers, so the notices, and then cover the labels which are used by communities. Um, and after we introduce each, we will share some examples of them in use and hope that they would be relevant to you. And if they are not, we have many more examples on our website as well, which is linked in the collaborative docs. But as we start our discussion later on as well, if there's anything of interest to you that you would like to know of, please let us know. So the notices are tools for institutions and researchers. At Local Context, we believe that institutions and researchers have a part to play in this work. They have a responsibility to disclose indigenous collections and data. And also to help with that, we created the notices. They were developed to create pathways for partnership, collaboration, and support for indigenous communities of indigenous cultural authority. The notices were developed when our leadership came to find that institutions and researchers are on their own journeys in this work and can do something to help make visible indigenous data in collections and so on, so that communities can find their traditional knowledge and belongings and be part of the decision-making about the access and use of those items. The notices can be used on a range of materials, as I've mentioned. They can help to disperse some of the labor involved in this work from communities, going back into institutions and researchers who often have greater familiarity with the data and the materials. So we describe them in three categories, which function differently to communicate different indigenous interests. So first, our engagement notice, open to collaborate. This notice is for an institution or researcher to commit to ethical, reciprocal engagement with indigenous communities. This is often where we will see institutions and researchers start. The next is our disclosure notices, attribution incomplete, biocultural, and traditional knowledge. This is working towards, these notices are for identifying and sharing where where there are indigenous collections. So this works towards that challenge of supporting communities to find and access their collections and knowledge, while also disclosing if there are any errors or whatever the case might be within those collections for not just community members, but the public as well. And the third category is the collections care notices. They were developed more recently within the past year in collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. These were created for collections in physical storage stewarded outside of communities to make clear when specialized cultural care is needed. So unlike the other four notices, these collections care notices were designed to be printed onto to physically label collections within their spaces and be used after consultation with communities. Even though the other notices can also be printed should they be used in a physical space, the collections care are more for internal collections as opposed to outward facing collections, which the other four are more there to represent. Let's see. The notices are applied by institutions and researchers who are stewarding those belongings information and are being used to clearly identify indigenous rights and responsibilities that are present, not what those rights and responsibilities are. That remains with the community. So before we go into the use of these notices so far, these are the three parts of the notice that we have. The notices have set titles and descriptions that don't change whenever they're used. This is meant to be a quick indication of indigenous knowledge in a collection, but meant to be easily identifiable, as well as the icon, which does not change as well. And especially for the icons, if they're used independently and linked elsewhere to the description, they're meant to be a quick identifier of indigenous knowledge within a collection item, etc. The main text has been standardized as a simplified marker of indigenous collections. And we have, oh, a little wonky, but we have titles and texts currently available in English, Creo Maori, French, and Spanish. So here's one example of the European Reference Genome Atlas, or ERGA, websites. They are currently using the Open to Collaborate notice on their website. ERGA is an international consortium of biodiversity researchers aiming to sequence high-quality genomes for all European species. By using the Open to Collaborate notice on their homepage, they're making it clear the platform's committed to collaboration and ethical relationships. They have also released within their metadata structure applications of the notices as well. This example is the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfield's Collections, their catalog. They are using the Open to Collaborate notice, Attribution Incomplete, BC, and TK notices in their online collections platform. The notices have been added to items within the African, South Pacific, and Native Arts of the Americas collections at Newfields. And they integrated the notices as part of their overhaul of their online collections portal, which is within KEEMU. That's how you pronounce it. These updates to their technical infrastructure and existing systems also allow for possibilities of labels to be added in the future as well. Within the record, the notices are below any of the photos and basic identifying information, and above the more detailed artwork metadata. The content disclaimer and usage rights on each item also includes that some works may have labels or notices which attribute cultural authority. And the location of the notices is important there because we always try to make sure that the labels or notices are as close to the information of the data as possible, as high up on the page as possible, as one of the first indications that there is indigenous knowledge within this space. Okay, so those are some examples of the notices. Again, we have many more, but we're going to switch over to talk about the labels. So the local context labels support indigenous communities to reinsert their cultural authority and sovereignty into these spaces. Communities can use these labels to clearly state provenance, protocols, and permissions of materials. They are a way to keep indigenous rights and interests within collections and data as they move through different systems, particularly digital environments. The labels are assigned by communities in ways that are consistent with the existing community rules, governance, and protocols. The goal of the labels is to support that basic acknowledgement and attribution, but they also move towards supporting indigenous authorship, access, authority, and sovereignty, and institutional accountability. Like the notices, the labels were designed to be flexible, and so a label may be applied to a website, database, or more specifically on a single item of cultural heritage, data set, etc. When they're added to materials, they are a visible indicator to anyone who accesses the material that to understand that it's an ongoing significance to the communities from where it comes from. They are educational and extra-legal markers, and they're not tied to who owns the material. And so by extra-legal, we mean that the labels are not legally binding or enforceable by law. So, as I mentioned earlier, indigenous peoples largely are not the owners of their materials, so the labels were created to also not be tied to who owns the materials. We have 20 traditional knowledge labels and which are used for cultural heritage materials such as art and cultural belongings, library materials, publications, but also archives, photographs, videos of indigenous people. TK labels identify cultural material that has community-specific conditions regarding access and use. And then we have T10 BC or biocultural labels, which were developed to support community expectations for biocultural collections and data. So the BC labels are to support indigenous people's rights to decide how collections and data that come from their lands and waters are used. So here we'll take a look at what these labels actually look like. We won't have time to go through all of the labels today, but I encourage you guys to take a look, read through them on our website if you're interested. We have both links, English and Spanish, on there as well. First, provenance label. This is the TK multiple communities label. A community uses this label if there are multiple communities that have responsibilities of custodianship and/or ownership over specific material or a piece of data or data set. For example, 4 Wabanaki nations in Maine have customized this label so they can use it, for instance, on a research project taking place across multiple nations' homelands. Second, we have the protocol label, a protocol label. The example of this here is the TK seasonal label. This label is about connecting knowledge and land. So a community uses this label if there are seasonal associations with the material or data. So for instance, certain songs and stories are only meant to be told during a certain time of year. If that was the case, this label would be used to make that clear. And then last, we have a permission label, the TK non-commercial. Yes, the TK non-commercial. This would be used by a community if they would like to indicate that the material or data is not able to be used for non-commercial purposes. So with that last example, there is a TK version, which you see here, and a BC version as well. So there may be multiples of the different types of labels, depending on what context they should be relevant in. We've seen the use of the BC Open to Collaboration label, for example, by the Maori Iwi Whakatohia, Iwi meaning tribe, and they use it on biodiversity samples collected from their homelands. And I believe we have an example of that coming up as well. So just like the notices, there are 3 parts to a label. Each label comes with template text that we have developed as a starting place for communities, but the title and the description are completely customizable by communities. The only thing that is not able to change are the icons. Again, the icons are a quick visual identifier to be able to know what is being said or would like to be said for these items. And so the icon stays the same, but the title here in English, and then, okay, that one looks good. In Spanish as well. We have translations for the same languages for the labels in Te Reo Maori, English, French, and Spanish. But again, communities are able to customize it. We've often seen communities translate the title and description, or maybe just the title, into their own language to better assert their rights over these items using their own indigenous languages. Okay, so here is an example of the labels in use. This instance of labels is applied by communities on materials circulating outside of their community. So Manaki Whenua Land Care Research is a Crown research institution in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They have biological collections of national significance and at a large scale represented by over 700,000 digitized specimen records, which are available on their online database. They applied a BC notice to every single one of these records. Most of their samples are geolocated, and so they're able to identify the about 1,400 plus specimens collected from, for example, the rohi or lands of Te Whakatohia, who have applied 4 labels, the BC Provenance, BC Research, BC Open to Collaboration, and BC Open to Commercialization. Te Whakatohia decided to apply these 4 labels across all of the specimens collected from their lands. With these labels, they're indicating that they want the provenance of their community recognized. They give permission for these biocultural materials and data to be used for research purposes, that they are open to future commercialization and collaboration, and they're open to future collaboration, but also assert their rights to participate in discussions on future commercialization opportunities. Here's another example of Whakatohia as well on their Waiata app. Their Waiata app was produced by the computer science department at Waikato University, of songs and chants that can be downloaded from Apple Store and Google Play. They have used many different label examples, but on the right, they have the TK verified label, meaning that this song and the information of that song are being marked as true, correct, and comes from Te Whakatohia. This is another example of a project between the Fungi Foundation and the Quechua indigenous people of Sarayaku in Ecuador. A unique feature of this project is that the labels are applied jointly by the Quechua community and the Living Forest. The community has customized relevant labels and applied them to that project. And the TK seasonal label notes specifically that the protective beings related to the mushrooms are only visible during the rainy seasons. So that's another example of the TK seasonal label in use in a different way that was mentioned earlier. Okay. So now I wanted to talk a bit about the local context hub, what it is. The hub is a tool that we developed to facilitate the application of labels and notices. On the hub, Indigenous communities can customize and apply their traditional knowledge labels and bicultural labels to their own materials that are stewarded or ones that are stewarded elsewhere. The community account, which is the first on that list, is for Indigenous or local communities that might be represented by a cultural center, a TIPO in the United States, a tribal historic preservation officer, a land department within an iwi or tribe, and so on. Institutions and researchers working with Indigenous collections and data can generate and apply notices and notify communities about any relevant collections and data. So the institution account differs from the researcher accounts in that there can be more people within institution accounts, whereas a researcher account is for an individual. And this is for individuals conducting research, gathering data, publishing, whatever the case might be. And they can apply notices on data themselves. The institution account is meant for institutions, organizations, could be university or library within a university, whatever the case might be. And the last account there will be a new account type coming in January to the hub, service providers. So these service providers are companies or other organizations that offer platforms like databases or repositories, collection management systems that won't necessarily use the labels or notices themselves, but may have built a connection to the hub into their platform so their users can utilize the notices and labels within their platform. And I will also talk about the service providers a little bit more in depth later on as well. So this is an example of an institution creating a project on the hub. When an institution, researcher, or community has items that they would like to indicate contain indigenous knowledge, they would create a project. This project is meant to describe what a notice or label is being applied to. So in the images here, we see a project being created by an institution. The institution can select which notices they feel would apply best to the scope of the project. They can select one or multiple notices, as well as the different translations that we have. Then they would add project metadata, starting with the title of the project and a description. Just a note, the hub is not meant to be a data repository. It's meant to refer to data and materials held outside of the hub, whether it's in another database, collection management software. It could also refer to a website, whatever it is that the scope is applying to. The project metadata is meant to be descriptive enough, especially when created by institutions or researchers, for communities to be able to see and know what the project is about and what they would be applying their labels to. So with that, within the rest of the project, there's other information that can be added, such as project links that might be relevant, project contact. So if anybody's interested in contacting whoever created this project, who would that be? It may not be the person creating the project, but it may be another individual stewarding that collection or whatever the case might be. There's also additional identifiers such as DOIs or accession numbers that can be added along with other collaborators within the hub. And also our newest feature, boundary, that can be added to the project to indicate where the project scope is situated. The boundary feature is still a work in progress, but our first step towards allowing communities to be able to find their items, even if the institution or researcher is unsure of who it belongs to. It provides more provenance information for the communities to add their voice to that project through labels. Once saved, an institution is able to notify a community of this project. This allows the community on the hub to go in and have the option to apply their customized labels to that project. And before we get to the label application piece, I just wanted to show briefly the label customization process that communities do through the hub as well. So here we have a view of the communities page where they have some labels that have already been customized in black, not sure if, yeah, okay. And some that are waiting for approval in gray. Whenever a label is customized, another community member is required to review the label and either approve or request edits to the label. This process is meant to support collaborative decision-making within communities and within the community accounts in the hub. And to customize a label, a community member can select that label that hasn't been customized yet, add their text in any language they'd like. They can add an audio file. They can also add multiple translations in addition to the default text that would be that first section in step 2. Once the labels are customized and approved, they can be applied to projects. So let's look at what that process looks like here. There we go. So if a community, when a community is notified of a project, they can go into that same project and they can select a project status. So we have 4 project statuses. One, acknowledge the notice. So if the community wants to let the institution or researcher know, we've received this project. We still haven't decided what we would like to do for that, but just letting you know we've seen it. Labels pending, they decide, okay, yes, we would like to put labels on this project, but we don't really know. We need to deliberate. We need to figure out what labels would apply to this scope, but they're coming. No labels pending. Maybe the community has decided that they would not like to apply any labels, which is their right to do so as well. And they would indicate that with that status. And then the last status is the labels applied status, which is not selectable by the community. It's auto-generated once labels are actually applied onto the project. And so to do that, they would click apply labels. They would be able to see all of their approved labels. They can select whichever labels they would like to apply to that project. It doesn't need to match the notices that were applied by the institutions or researchers. So if an institution puts a BC notice or a TK notice and the community reviews it and says, well, this actually has BC related items, they have the right to add that regardless of what the notice is saying. So they would do that and then apply those. And then if we take a look at the same project, we can see here that now the labels are applied to that project. And it will include all of the translations, all of the text, anything that was originally customized for that label. So the next example that I wanted to show is of the Morea Biocode project, which, funny enough, was actually mentioned this morning as well. The project works on DNA barcoding in the ecosystem of the island of Morea, located in French Polynesia. This ecosystem has over 5,000 identified species, and the project itself has collected and sequenced over 30,000 specimens. So as part of the collecting effort, the Morea Biocode project has developed tools to track data from the collecting event, specimen identification, photography, laboratory, and ultimately to host institution and sequence repositories. One aspect of this work is using Genome, a metadatabase that records details around biosamples and genetic sequences. So next, I'm going to show a short clip that is an example of the creation of the Morea Biocode project within the hub and Genome's integration of the hub's API, or application program interface, to have the two systems communicate with one another and have the notices and labels from those projects appear in Genome.
Want to press the button?
Yeah, sure. You guys ready? Sign it in the sun. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're live, baby.
Okay, so now we see we've got a RDA Biocode 1.0 project. So then this gives us a project URL. John, is this what you're gonna need to take to Geom?
Yeah.
Okay, so now it's your turn.
Yeah, yay.
So here are some of the samples from one of the teams on the biocode project. And then now we also see when we look at any of these samples that they now have inherited the notices. It could have traditional knowledge interest, it could have biocultural interest, and the attribution is incomplete. This is the Atatia Center community page. So our contact with them got it.
So as you saw, when a project is created in the hub, project unique identifier is generated. And that unique ID is what's used to pull information on the project that has any labels or notices associated with that project through the API. So with this connection to the hub, with the ID, the genome was able to have the notices or labels appear on the relevant records immediately or automatically. In the video, you saw the notices appear on those records when the link was made, because at the time, of course, they had just generated the notices, so that's all that was there. Then they notified the community. The community since has started working on applying labels to that project as well, which we can see here. Now the project of the Morea Biocode and the hub has the labels added by the community, and with that API connection, automatically updated within Genome as well. So with that example and many of the other previous examples that we've shown so far, it represents the human readable integrations of the images and texts on websites, databases, etc. But how does the database that holds that specimen's data or any other database store the label or notice metadata? So first, let's take a look at the project metadata. This is the information from the project that can usually be mapped onto any other metadata structures, as these tend to be standard fields available in many, if not all, structures. Of course, we know of this as the structures included, and many more, in the FAIR principles. And this is what it would look like within the API, the information that the website would be collecting to display the labels or notices or that project information. But what's missing, of course, are the labels and notices. So where do these fit within other systems, such as databases or websites where indigenous voices have not previously had a space? So one option, one option is to use already existing fields. that are standard across all databases. The most common fields for labels and notices that they have been added to across systems have been rights fields. This example shown here is from data sites, local context notices and labels metadata guidelines. Rights fields within metadata define the set of rights, including access and copyright for a specific digital object. Rights fields tend to be standard, though may not always be the best fit for labels and notices, which of course deal with indigenous rights, but are extra legal. So because of this, some individuals have opted to using their own custom created field to add the labels and notices to, if they're able to. So this example here is from the Library of Congress, where they used the rights field, but they also created a separate traditional knowledge labels field within the JSON of their records. So while specific, this information also poses a bit of an issue for the labels and notice information to not be able to stay associated with the data that the labels or notices are being added to. If they are not added to an already existing field that multiple systems are expecting to see, odds are that this information will be ignored. This is an issue that Manaki Whenua has been experiencing. One of the examples from earlier, they've been dealing with this since records of their database are also pulled and shared by GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. They added their labels and notices into a custom local context or traditional knowledge field, but of course, that's not being pulled by GBIF because they don't know to look for it. So until a space for indigenous voices is standardized within metadata spaces, another solution would be to utilize already existing fields that specify how data can be used. So an example of this that I would like to show is the work that I've been doing mapping each of the labels and notices into schema.org. So with the help of ODIS, the Ocean Data Information System, we've been going through schema.org and mapping each of the labels and notices to fields that are already available based on the intent of the label or notices. This is an example that we've done so far of the TK verified label. There are some fields that are not included at the moment because that's expanded in another section, but these mappings are still being drafted, but they are close to completion. Once they're published, we hope to continue the work between multiple systems that have standardized application of the labels in different places. So for example, GBIF uses Darwin Core. So one potential outcome of the schema.org mappings is to create a crosswalk between schema.org and Darwin Core to allow for GBIF to be able to take in and show the labels and notices in their metadata and on their platform. So these are meant to be recommendations as a way to start making the labels machine actionable. This opens up more possibilities to allow for systemic processes to work alongside the community's voice. And by allowing for space for the labels and notices within metadata, it allows for greater control over the application and use of indigenous data and indigenous knowledge for collective benefit. And now I am going to pass it on to Raina. Oh, you're saying, okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley. So my name is Raina Jenkins. I am the Associate Director of the World Data System International Technology Office. And our perspective here is to encourage and help repositories to integrate tools like local contexts to support the CARE principles. So I'm here to provide a little bit of motivation and further context to what Ashley just showed you. So first of all, I wanted to start with my own land acknowledgement. So as a guest here to Costa Rica, where we have 8 indigenous peoples over 24 territories, And this is a country with really rich biodiversity. So I will be speaking to this more in my slides, but at this point, I also want to just express some recognition of some new piece of frameworks that came out at the Coalition of Parties for Biodiversity just a couple weeks ago, Article 8J, and this highlights the role that Indigenous people play in biodiversity conservation. And then furthermore, I am based at the University of Victoria, and for that, I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory that university stands, and the Lekwungen and the Saanich peoples whose historic relationship with the land continues to this day. But furthermore, we just continue to emphasize the care principles being representatives of the data repository community and how we have to continue to revise our practices to be consistent with those principles. So just to give you some overview about the World Data System for those that might be unfamiliar. So the mission of the World Data System is really to enhance the capabilities, impact, and sustainability of our member data repositories and data services. So this is by creating those trusted communities of scientific data repositories, strengthening the scientific enterprise throughout the entire life cycle of data, and also advocating for accessible data and transparent and reproducible science. So this is a map of the not only the membership, but the staff and the scientific committee and our early career researcher network internationally. So while we have great international representation, we're always trying to expand into more of have a better geospatial footprint, also a multidisciplinary footprint. And so we have lots of work to do, but we're already having about 140 members worldwide. Oops, sorry. And just to point out that we have two main offices. So I'm from the International Technology Office in Canada, where we have our PI is David Castle, and we have 4 staff, Chantel, Alyssa, Andrea, and Emily. And then for the International Program Office based in at the University of Tennessee, and Meredith, I think, and Danielle are here in the audience. I saw them a minute ago. Yeah. They're representing the program office here, and they have a small team as well. So I also want to point out a recent paper that came out with respect to data repositories. So this was, I think it came out in July, Earth Science Data Repositories, ways to implement the CARE principles. They come up with 4 categories of activities that a repository can do to actually put these principles into practice. So they break this down into situational awareness, outreach, repository protocols, and the technology. And so I've just taken a snippet from there, showing you the technology activities that one can do and how they map to the CARE principles. So oftentimes one activity will map to multiple CARE principles or vice versa. And then one example I'm highlighting here is the T8 to implement badging mechanisms. And what the example they give is about the local context labels and notices. So certainly this comes up there. And so I just wanted to further emphasize that. But there are many other good ideas that you can take a look through. While this came out of the earth science community, I think that a lot of almost all, if not all, of the activities they mentioned would apply more broadly. So to go on a little bit more from what we were seeing with the integration into the schema.org dataset metadata that has been going on with the Ocean Data and Information System. And also this is, I also want to say that the schema.org cluster at the Earth Science Information Partners and the Polar Data Search are on the periphery of this work as well. So these are systems that are premised on schema.org metadata as a way to so the cluster is a working group activity, but Otis and the Polar Data Search are harvesters from data repositories. And so as these harvester systems that are based on schema.org are able to represent this local context information, I hope that encourages repositories to start to integrate these labels, knowing that they will be propagating along with these major harvesters. And Otis in particular is really important. It shows up as a key direction for how to have a digital representation of the ocean as part of the Ocean Decade, one of the 8 challenges, or sorry, it's the 8th of 10 challenges in the Ocean Decade, which we are now almost halfway through, 2020 to 2030. So this vision paper just came out within the last few months, and it really highlights ODIS as a direction that data management should strive to. So for all those ocean data repositories out there, it's a good idea to start, if you don't already, have the schema.org metadata consistent with the ODIS. They have these on their profile documentation, they describe how to use schema.org in particular to be compatible or interoperable with their system. And they're working on this documentation about how to represent local context, and that isn't there today, but should be there hopefully in the not too far future. And so you can keep your eye out for that and use that as a guiding pathway to how you can represent that. Similarly, the polar data search focuses on polar data. It has over 20 polar data repositories internationally participating, and that's continually growing. They're too going to add this to the best practice guide once it's available, and work on expanding the search portal to actually show those labels. So that's work to happen, but just to know that that is intended and hopefully motivating if you have data in the polar space. I'm going to continue a little bit more on that, the Convention on Biological Diversity that just happened, because there's some key points that came out of those discussions that support the local context work. So this took place in Colombia, of course, just a couple weeks ago. And there's this document called Article 8J. And this pertains to Indigenous peoples and local communities. It's available. I have the links here for English and Spanish, but I believe it's available in 5 different languages. And this particular text really does give recognition to Indigenous peoples on the work that they've been doing to apply, preserve, and maintain the traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices in relation to promoting conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So that if you dig deeper into that article, it also includes the notion of sharing benefits of the utilization of any genetic resources and digital sequence information on those genetic resources. That is found. So this is really important for data repositories because they're going to be the ones that enable this information to be available to the downstream users of these data who may have commercial benefits or something, and that they'll be signing, and all the countries that are signing on to this Article 8J, then we'll have to have pathways to do that. Now, it's going to be voluntary, but we have to support that potential. So, yeah, while I mentioned that this will be a voluntary monetary benefit sharing, if any companies are using these digital sequence information, they need to have that information available to them to know that there are Indigenous communities that should be acknowledged and gain from that profits that they might be making. So there's another document referred to as the Digital Sequence Information on Genetic Resources. This builds on prior work that has come out in the last few years, the Nagoya Protocol and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Access, Benefit, and Sharing. Again, available in multiple languages, and the links are there. But in there, I want to point out this new language that comes up here is it's promoting to be consistent with the open access to data and to abide by the fair, care, and trust principles. So this is the first notion of trust principles being embedded into this documentation, which is really great to see. So all the data repositories, hopefully you're seeing that and knowing that this is, you know, at the level of what's happening at the coalition of parties. Furthermore, if we look at how are we going to support that traceability for the digital sequence information, we need that provenance metadata. We need to be able to trace what digital sequence information is being used and what Indigenous communities are associated to that. So I think the local context metadata is one of the really great approaches to doing that. And I don't know of others right now, but that are machine readable and interoperable, but there might be other approaches. But there is this policy brief that was put out by Local Context a few months back. And this is actually advocating for the use of the provenance metadata labels that were described to those kinds of digital sequence information data. So that's available both English and Spanish on Zenodo. And so please have a look at that, especially if you are a repository with digital sequence information data. Back to Ashley.
Yeah. So I also did want to add as well, for the schema.org recommendations, there is a link. I know there are a lot of links on the collaborative doc, but we just wanted to make sure that you had them from the presentation as well. But there is one within the links that links to our metadata GitHub. And that's where we will be putting updates, not just on schema.org, but other conversations that we're having for different metadata structures that we've been mapping or that people have expressed interest in. We need people who are familiar with these structures to help with the mapping as well. We can only do so much when it comes to the recommendations. I am not an expert in different metadata structures, but going through schema.org with Pierluigi from Otis has been really helpful, and we work together to figure out where the labels fit best based on the intent of those. So definitely check that out. Start some discussions in there if there's a metadata structure that you would like to see this applied to. And I will leave it at that. And on the slide here, we have other Spanish resources as well. So our websites, there are select pages that are translated. All the labels and notice texts are translated. So definitely have a look for that. We have a few films that have Spanish subtitles added to them. The policy brief that Rena was just talking about as well. The care principles, of course, are translated into multiple languages, including Spanish. And we are hoping to have the presentation from COP16 that Rena was talking about included on our website at some point soon as well. Just getting some, last minute approvals, but definitely check out our blog. We will be posting any resources that are relevant there as well. Okay, so next we're going to talk about for the hub, there are certain, based on the account type that you're utilizing, there are hub agreements that we have developed and are launched and will be added to the hub itself in January. I believe Lori Hack is on Zoom. Not sure if you're able to.
I am.
If you would like to talk a little bit about the hub agreements.
Sure. So there's 3 types of hub agreements. I think the one that's most pertinent for this particular talk is the service provider agreement. This is an agreement that our organization has developed to work with folks that are managing repositories that a variety of different people use. And this is a program actually that Ashley runs, and it assists repositories in figuring out how to implement local context labels and notices in the platform. And part of the video that you saw with the iPlaces platforms, they are actually a member of our service provider early adopter program that helped us work through how our APIs can support repository managers in implementing labels and notices in the platform. So if you're interested in doing that kind of work, we encourage you to contact us. I think info@localcontext.org would probably be the best place to go, or support@localcontext.org, and just say, hey, we're interested in exploring the service provider program. Again, there's the early adopter program has closed, but this is a program that's open to any repository anywhere in the world. And it does provide a lot of hands-on support, through Ashley and our online documentation for working with you on how to integrate those the label and notices functionality into your platform. So that's the main one. There is a fee for that. There's a fee right now. It's $1,500 US per year to be a service provider. It comes with a certification process. So once you complete the initial phases of implementation, we will go through it with you. And then when you've completed the requirements, you will receive a certification from us, and we will list your platform on our website, on our service provider page. That helps you kind of say, hey, I've done this and finished it. And it also helps the community as they're looking for platforms that they can use to support Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's the main one. We have two other hub agreements. One is for subscribers, and these are organizations such as museums or libraries or I'm drawing a blank here. Museums, any other kind of research institution, data repository that are actually seeking to generate notices themselves. And you can do this through the institution, or we also have researcher subscription agreements. There are different tiered fees based on the number of people that you would like to include in your particular subscriber account. More information about that is on our website. As an individual, you can subscribe as a researcher. That is a free account. If you would like to use the API and would like to have more than one user in your account, that becomes an institution account. And there are fees starting at $1,250 US per year, which is a fairly nominal fee for most. So if you'd like to learn more about that, again, support at ORCID.org, or you can go to this webpage. I see that the link is not on here for what this webpage is for the hub agreements, but you can click on that to learn more. And we're happy to work with you on how to do this. So as we move on, local context is seeking to be fully supported through its subscriber piece here. We are currently supported through grant funding and looking to grow our support through subscribers. So we encourage you to consider becoming a subscriber if that makes sense for your organization. And we also have member agreements, and these are agreements for Indigenous community entities or representatives of those communities. These are also free accounts. And basically is a way to encourage those communities and provide a way for them to become part of the governance of local context. So local context is a nonprofit organization, and we do have a governing council. And the goal for us is to have a fully Indigenous council. Basically, to be eligible to be nominated for council, you do need to be a member. And we will start to have elections. We're hoping to open up the nominations and elections process in 2025. So this is part of how we see ourselves both being governed by our primary community of Indigenous communities, private constituency, of Indigenous communities, but also receive support from subscribers for the ongoing work, generational work that we need to be doing on behalf of Indigenous data sovereignty. So if there's any, and also in terms of scaling is working with service providers, repository managers to ensure that as people want to use local context, whether those are Indigenous communities or subscribers, that there are platforms out there that have implemented local context APIs and support application and provisioning of labels and notices. So any questions about those, I'm here online. You can also contact us at support@localcontext.org to continue the conversation.
Sorry. Can our AV people unmute the audio from the stage to the Zoom? Sorry, I'll put something.
Yeah, no worries. We'll add the next steps in there as well, and I can repeat it later on. But yes, you can go in and generate a notice. The easiest notice to get started with is the Open to Collaborate notice. We are always here to help institutions, researchers, or communities to get started on the hub as well. So definitely reach out to us if you have any questions. And we'll just start the discussion in a moment.
Okay, I don't know if there's someone that can let the AV person know we don't have sound on the Zoom. But okay. Oh, it's working now. Okay. Okay, so we prepared just a few questions for the discussion, but if you want to share something that's beyond the scope of these questions, that's welcome too, but I'll just kind of quickly go through them. So the first one is regarding, has your organization begun to implement local context labels and notices, or even begun to kind of look at that? And if so, what is your experience like? So for example, I have had that experience at my previous institution, trying to apply this to ocean data with indigenous communities. So it'd be nice to hear if anyone has been exploring this in their own communities. I know one person wrote into the collaborative document online that they've beginning to do this in Australia at the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. So that's great to hear. And then the next question is, if you're utilizing metadata schemas for which local context integration does not exist yet, what other schemas should be targeted? So the schema.org work is happening, the Darwin Core work is anticipated next, and it's already been done for DataCite, but what other schemas are high priority for your integration work? And then following on in this notion of the test hub, where you can sort of play around and explore the tool in more detail, we thought that maybe it would be nice for repository personnel to have access to a workshop where we just go through that tool and allow that hands-on access where you can create a login and play around and really see what it has to offer, as well as the API. So just let us know if you think that would be a helpful service offering for the repository community, for any representatives here. So you're welcome to raise your hand if you're in the room and or on the Zoom, basically the same thing, but on Zoom. And I lost my Zoom connection, so, okay. Oh, okay.
Hello, I'm Claudia from Brazil, and this is a very interesting session. One thing that struck me ever since the CARE principle started being discussed is the lack of engagement of South American researchers who work. I cannot represent Latin American researchers as a whole, but South American researchers, in which there's lots of work going on with indigenous communities. And I was wondering, I've tried engaging them, it's really hard, but maybe now with this kind of work, the sort of, I hesitate to call it service, but the sort of plus added information or whatever that can be added to their work can be more visible than abstract care principles. So how do you suggest we go about attracting more people from the South America, or even, well, Latin American indigenous communities, because there's lots and lots of such communities with whom anthropologists and other researchers are working at whatever the propositions. And thank you for showing the whole infrastructure.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. So first, from the local context point of view, even in the US or anywhere else that we've been working with, let's say, indigenous, with institutions or researchers first and foremost that want to work with a community or a single community member that indicates interest in local contexts, they still have to, of course, go back to their community and let the community know about local context and what we do and what the labels are about or for, and if the community would like to join. So for that, we do have a community interest letter. That's kind of like a template letter. We have both in English and Spanish at the moment. That is meant to be like a sort of introduction to the community as a whole or to specific council members or whomever within the community, to let them know about local contexts, what we do, the work that's being done, and if they are interested to further work with us, to if they have questions or whatever the case might be. So that's one step on that side. We also, for communities that may not have a stable or much of the internet access, the labels, we have a packet in both English and Spanish of the labels with the template text that can be printed or saved as a PDF or whatever the case might be for offline use. So we've seen communities do that, work together, work on the customization of the labels, and once they're ready, if they're able to add it to the hub themselves, or if they would like us to add that information on their behalf to the hub to be able to utilize in those cases as well. And then outside of local context, we've seen communities get interested either if institutions or researchers that are managing the data that's theirs are interested in local contexts. And that's one avenue of kind of getting the communities interested or learning about local contexts, or through different presentations and whatnot. If repositories start also adapting the labels and notices, as more people see it, then more kind of interest will come about in terms of, well, what are they meant to do? And then eventually, hopefully, how can we utilize this ourselves? I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll just add something from a data repository maybe perspective, or at least from my own data repository perspective. So one idea might be if you are a repository, and you might be, there's I guess two situations where you're working directly with indigenous communities, or you're working with researchers who might be working with indigenous communities. So you might actually want to reach out to local contacts and do a joint workshop, in person or virtual, where you can let your research community know, or your indigenous communities that you're working with be aware of some of these tools, and just to kind of begin those conversations and expose them to what the potential is. So I know Local Context was more than willing to work with my repository to set up a workshop where we did that all online, and that was with indigenous community representatives. And that was just a nice way for them to begin to get exposed to the tool and get some comfort by playing around in that test hub I was mentioning. So you could facilitate these kind of workshops with your own communities. Any other questions or stories to share? Or online? I can see.
Maybe rewording the first question, has your organization begun to think about implementing the CARE principles or creating policies that would allow for this work to be done from an organizational standpoint? And if not, then why not?
Where's our mic person? Well, I can repeat the question if you want to ask it.
I don't want to monopolize anything. It's just that I don't see if there are other people raising their hands, okay? So if I think of where I work at a university that has 2,000 researchers that do a research on anything from astronomy to zoology, okay? And a few of those are anthropologists or social scientists who work with indigenous populations. So your question about institution, it's very hard to apply in this context because it will depend on the individual researchers to be attracted to what you are offering and then contact the indigenous populations to see what the interest would be. But this is my context because we do not have, as an institution, this tradition. Of course, as an institution, all over institutions do respect indigenous knowledge. There are laws in Brazil. I'm talking about Brazil now. But the question is too high level, at least from my point of view. I don't know about other people from the same region or how they would feel. Okay.
Hi, Gabriela from Costa Rica. Well, I work in one of the public universities here, Universidad Nacional, and sure, as Claudia says, we have a lot of experience working with and in indigenous territories, from biology to social issues, okay? And we work with a lot of, we do a lot of citizen science. I wanted to ask you if you have in your programs some experience with citizen science, that the people from the communities do science, collecting things and all that. But answering your question, then we have a lot of experience and we have a lot of policies to avoid intrusions and things like that. But we don't have, we have not been thinking of that kind of things. Even the indigenous data sovereignty is something quite new that we are just beginning to introduce. It's not that the people have been making bad things. It's just that they haven't think about doing it and thinking about data that they collect in indigenous territory at subject to sovereignty. Those are things that are quite new. Then I love the proposition. I wanted to go and talk with you to see how we begin like workshops, because I think what we need is not only with researchers, but we have a lot of indigenous students. And then I want to begin something like make them do some citizen science, but they are future professionals that can be using this schema to begin to do their work as researchers and as indigenous professionals.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I guess should have been a little bit more clear with the first question. So typically what we've seen so far, our largest kind of user base are researchers. And it's typically, of course, researcher within an institution doing the work, right? And so that's where the notices tend to start, with the researchers starting, since they're the ones that know the data, can apply the notices, reaching out to the communities, doing that work. So not just organizational, because we do know that the work tends to start with the researchers, usually individuals that are doing this work day to day. the only thing to keep in mind as an individual researcher working within an institution, let's say, is just making sure that for longevity, that there are either policies in place within the institution or some other way to continue to have that work continue, or to not have that work dissolved after, let's say, the researcher moves somewhere else or whatever the case might be. Because even if a researcher leaves that space, that doesn't mean that the indigenous connections to those items disappear, right? So just making sure that as a researcher, that when you are applying the notices and working with communities to apply labels, that there is some sort of structures in place to maintain those connections as well. And so for the hub, right, for one thing that we are trying to make sure is that, you know, all of the projects, when we indicate that a notice should be displayed somewhere, we always also recommend that the project page link or the ID number stays with the notice or labels as well, just in case there is some sort of disconnection somewhere, because that project page will remain on the local context hub. We don't delete it, especially if there are labels on the projects. The project cannot be deleted. The only time that we would do that is if we get contacted directly by a community or institutional researcher saying, you know, this really, here's why this needs to be taken off, or whatever the case might be. But we're hesitant to do that because that's the link back to the indigenous voices of that item, that data, etc. So yeah, when talking about researchers, we do know researchers tend to be that first step, but hopefully working from the ground up and making sure that the voices can stay with those data as well.
Okay, and then two more points to add to what Ashley was saying there is, well, one is the data management plan. So that's an opportunity earlier with the researchers to try and maybe embed something in the templates, or when you're working with researchers on setting up their data management plans, to have them think about the Indigenous data governance part of it. I saw earlier in the Zoom chat that there was some initiative in Canada to do that. So that's one pathway. Another one is coming back to your point about citizen science. So in my own experience, I've worked in situations where this is when I was working at Ocean Networks Canada, where we had citizen science to go collect data in the ocean, and that data was uploaded, and many of those data were collected by Indigenous community citizen scientists that were going out in the field and uploading their data. And then in other cases, it's like nonprofits or other kinds of citizen scientist communities that are also sampling in areas, but that might be in territories belonging to the Indigenous or of the Indigenous communities. And so there are sometimes also partnerships in place to honor the local communities that they're sampling in. So so I do have some experience in the citizen science realm of that, but I'd be open to discussing more about that for sure. So I guess we're at time, right? Or do you want to say one more thing? So the clicker's not working now.
Yes, so it does look like
There's a question online. Can you guys hear that? Somebody has their hand up online.
Okay. Do we have a little bit more time to continue?
Well, I guess
I'm not
technically the
getting
break is
anything.
happening now, but
Yeah, Claire Austin has had her hand up for a while. So if you could take her question, that'd be awesome.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Right.
Go ahead.
So real quick, I put a link in the chat as was mentioned, and one approach you'll see we've added a module for Indigenous data sovereignty and implementation of care principles. So just to be aware that there exists already an RDA standard for machine actionable data management plans, which is applicable to all data. So the idea is that this would really force, I don't like to use that word, but to force people to document Indigenous data sovereignty, and then it would it would spread then out through all the systems. So I won't go on. I know we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. And that's good information to hear. And if you could put the link to any of that in the collaborative notes, that would be fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Please add to the collaborative docs, put your information there. If you have any questions, please let us know, contact us. There are some links in the doc to contact us. You can also email support@localcontext.org if you have any questions.